Hey folks, welcome back to Icon Designs. I've got a great video for you today because I will be building two different American flag cutting boards using some Purple Heart, African mahogany, and some hard maple. The first board I'll be building is going to be an edge grain cutting board, which you see on the left, and the second one will be an end grain cutting board. Both have their pros and cons. The edge grain is a little bit easier to make and have some brighter colors, but tends to show knife marks a lot easier, while the end grain cutting board shows some darker features and is harder to make but will last a lot longer. So if you want to see how I built it, then stick around. I'll be walking through the build for each of the boards separately, but first off I need to do some basic milling to get these long boards into some usable pieces that I can have for the project. I start off by taking the long boards over to my miter saw and chopping the pieces into the sizes that I'm going to be using for both the edge grain cutting board and the end grain cutting board. Once I have the pieces down to manageable size, I can then take them over to my jointer and my planer so that I've got some lumber that's S4S. After running two surfaces of all my stock through the jointer, I make a pencil mark on the face grain of the edges that have not been surfaced, and I run all the boards through the planer until all of the pencil marks have been removed from all the boards. I'm trying to get everything S4S while leaving the boards as thick as possible. The first board we're going to be making is the edge grain board, which is the orientation of the grain that you see on the left side of the screen. We also need to pay attention to the dimensions of the flag because everything has to be in relative proportion to one another. So I went to a website, which I'll have linked in the description, where you can put in the final width that you want for your board and it calculates what everything else needs to be. So with those dimensions calculated, I set my table saw fence to 1 inch, get my blade to the right height, and I start ripping the maple and mahogany strips to 1 inch. The final dimension needs to be 7/8, so I'm leaving a little bit of room so I can use the jointer and perhaps even the planer to get a perfect seamless fit between the stripes. Once the stripes are cut, I put everything on the table and you can see that it's already starting to look like a flag, and this is why the edge grain is so much easier. There's just not as many steps and as many glue ups involved. Now because I don't have as many parallel clamps as I would like, I'm going to have to do the glue up in different stages, but as I'm doing the glue ups it's really important to pay attention to the order in which the boards are going to make sure that the red and white stripe pattern for the flag is correct whenever it comes to final assembly. Another benefit of making an edge grain cutting board is that you can save yourself a ton of time on sanding by running it through the planer instead. I then use my crosscut sled to put a nice 90-degree edge on each of the pieces that were just glued up. Now one of the drawbacks to making an edge grain cutting board is that you do have two ingrained connections that need to have some reinforcement because ingrained to ingrained glue ups are inherently weak. So I'm going to be using a couple of 1/2-inch dowels to help bind those two together and add some additional strength between those two sections. To do this, I strike a line between the mating pieces and then use a square to transfer the line to the end grain on both pieces. To help stabilize my workpiece, I use some compression clamps against my workbench to hold it in place so that I can attach the self-centering jig where I line the 1/2-inch hole over the line that I just struck and then take a 1/2-inch drill bit and drill a hole perfectly straight into the section that will be receiving the dowel. With the holes drilled, I do a quick dry fit to make sure that the dowels fit. I then use some Titebond 3 to glue the dowels into the holes prior to the final glue up between the two pieces. Before gluing the two pieces together, I decided to do the CNC inlay work first because I had never done anything inlaid before. Whenever you inlay something with the CNC, it simply means that you create a female piece or a pocket and then you create a counterpart male piece that's supposed to fit into it like a puzzle, usually from a different color wood, so that the final product looks seamless, and if you do it correctly, it looks really, really good. But I was only about 60% sure this was going to work, so I decided to leave these two pieces separate until I did the CNC work, and thankfully it worked perfectly the first time. So once the star pockets were drilled, I then put a piece of maple down and cut out the male star counterparts that were going to go in the pockets to create the star pattern inlay for the American flag cutting board. Now, with the potential disaster averted, I went back to the two pieces, covered them in Titebond 3, and used some of my longer parallel clamps to sandwich the two pieces for the final glue up. Once that had a chance to dry, I then took it over to my kitchen table where I went through the tedious process of gluing each individual star into the inlay. I then used my parallel clamps and a piece of scrap wood to apply even, consistent pressure while the stars dried. The easiest way to get rid of the protruding pieces of each of the stars would be to use a bandsaw and just cut them flush with the existing surface, but I don't have a bandsaw, so I created a quick toolpath with my CNC and just did a quick surfacing run to knock down most of the excess protrusion. After most of the material was moved, one run through the planer knocked off the remaining excess and made the surface completely flat. It was then time to make one more trip to the parallel clamps for the final glue up, again using Titebond 3, and after that had a chance to dry, I took that board back over to the crosscut sled and put two final fresh edges on both sides of the board and made sure it was cut to the final dimension. Now, both boards will share a common process for finishing, sanding, those types of things. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this build here and then switch over to the in-grain cutting board and start that build. Now, the in-grain board takes a little bit more planning for each of the stripes, and the in-grain board is what you see here on the right. So rather than reaching for the milled lumber that we had done before, I take a step back and do some planning to make sure that I'm going to have the wood that I need to create the stripes and the blue part, which is the canton. So I start to categorize everything. 1 is the short side, 2 is the canton, and 3 is the long side. I then sketch up what my wood planning needs to look like in PowerPoint for each of those 3 sections, knowing what milled lumber I have to work with. This is really helpful so that you're not trying to think of this on the fly, you've already got these cuts planned. So with my cut list finalized, I then start ripping strips of mahogany and maple to create the boards. I then set my stop block on my crosscut sled to 6 inches and then begin fabricating the pieces I'm going to need. For the short stripe section, or section 1, I need 8 boards glued up together. The maple piece needs to be 6 inches long, while the mahogany piece needs to be 8 inches long because there's actually 4 red stripes and 3 white stripes. Once the glue had dried, I then began ripping 1 3/4 inch strips from those boards, which 1 3/4 inch is going to be the height of the cutting board whenever everything is done. I followed a similar process to create the canton out of Purple Heart. I ripped 2.5 inch strips from the wood and then did a big panel glue up, which I then later came back and ripped into strips that I could then turn on edge to create the canton. It was then time to go back to the parallel clamps to begin the glue up, and I tried to stagger the seams whenever possible. Once the two sections had a nice fresh edge on them, I then glued them up using some more Titebond 3. To create the long stripes for this in-grain cutting board, I followed a very similar process as before, only this time we used 13 strips in the glue up instead of just 8. This will give us a final length of 21 5/8, which will keep the flag in proportion to the other dimensions. Once the long stripes were in the clamps and drying, it was time to turn my attention to the in-grain glue-up panel where I would cut the white male insert stars from for this particular CNC operation. Once the pieces were cut, I glued up the edges using some Titebond 3 and left them into the clamps. And then I turned my attention to the CNC star pocket operation, and this is when I noticed that we had a problem. I didn't take any measurements before running the same toolpath as before, but this particular canton was actually 0.35 inches shorter than the edge grain one that I'd previously done. I had to run this through the jointer a few times to get all the seams to line up perfectly, and in the process of doing so, I made it so short that the top row of stars was actually outside of the bounds of the canton. So I stopped the machine to think about how I was going to salvage this particular project, and what I decided to do was to flip it over, because if you look at the stripes, they both start and end with a red stripe, so it's you can flip it over and basically have no impact to the project. And I redid a tool path with a tighter cluster of stars that fit within the area, and I decided that I would later surface the bottom of the cutting board about 1/4 of an inch to remove the pockets that were there previously. So I'm losing a little bit of height on the cutting board, but it's going to save the project. I'm convinced that we as woodworkers don't ever stop making mistakes. We just get better about fixing them whenever they happen. So with the crisis averted, I went back to the parallel clamps for the final glue up for this in-grain cutting board. Once I put a fresh clean edge on both sides of the board, I went back to my CNC to surface the star area similar to before, but because this is an in-grain cutting board, you can't run it through a planer, so instead I decided to surface it using a bit that was recommended to me by one of my viewers. He recommended the white size 6210, and I gotta tell you, this thing made quick work of my cutting board. I think I surfaced both sides in about 10 minutes. Once the top was done, I flipped the board over and started to work on erasing the mistake that I had made from earlier. I think I did this in 4 passes total to get rid of the pockets that were created on the underside of the board. The pockets were almost 1/4 of an inch deep, so it took quite a while to get rid of them, but this solution ended up working out perfectly. I just lost a little bit of height in the process. So the finishing touches for both boards are identical, so I thought I would just combine this section since they're both the same. Starting off with the sanding, I generally work my way up from 80 grit to 120 to 150, then 180, all the way up to 220, and I generally water pop before the 220 grit. After sanding, I normally install the cutting board feet, and some people ask me why I put feet on cutting boards because they don't like the way that they look, but they're very functional because they prevent the board from sliding around. But I did have to take those off almost immediately because I forgot that I hadn't cut the handles in on the board yet. So the feet came off, handles got cut, and then everything was right in the world. I've really come to like this style of handle because it's subtle and it gives you a really good gripping area whenever you pick up the board. To finish the board, I use a combination of mineral oil and beeswax. It's a really good finish and conditioner for the board and just makes it look fantastic. So now that both boards are done, it's time to do a side-by-side comparison. First, we have the edge grade cutting board. You see the colors are a lot brighter. The red from the mahogany and the white from the maple just stand out quite a bit more. I also like that the purple heart gives a really nice contrast against the maple stars in the canton of the flag. The one drawback from an edge grain cutting board is that it'll show knife marks a little bit easier because of the orientation of the grain itself. It's just one of the inherent drawbacks of having an edge grain cutting board. Here we have the end grain cutting board, and right away you can see the coloration is a lot darker. Even though it's the exact same type of wood, the end grain absorbs a lot more of the finish, which darkens the color of the wood a lot more. But one of the benefits of an end grain cutting board is it hides knife marks a lot better, making it much more suitable for day-to-day use. But I'm interested to know what you guys think. Which one is your favorite, knowing the pros and cons of both the edge grain cutting board and the end grain cutting board? Clearly they've got different colorations, but they both have the same theme. They're both made out of the same type of wood. So all things being equal, if you were in a store and you had to choose one or the other, which one would you choose? And that's going to be it for this video. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I'm having a blast with the CNC, and I'm going to be using this inlay technique more in the future as I get a handle on how to do it. So stay tuned for more, and I will see you on the next one.